We are looking at a book today that has sparked an incredible amount of intense debate, controversy, and quite frankly, a massive cultural conversation.
Oh, absolutely. It is everywhere right now.
It really is. Welcome to the Deep Dive. It's great to have you with us today.
Yeah, thanks for joining us for this one.
Before we even get started, I want to remind you to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss out on our content.
Definitely do that.
Our mission today is to unpack a highly provocative, incredibly comprehensive, and fiercely discussed ebook that has been making serious waves across the internet lately.
Making waves is putting it mildly, I think.
Right. We are tearing into Redpilled, the Manual for Men in the Modern World by Conrad Riker.
It's a dense read.
Very dense.
Yeah.
Now, whether you fundamentally agree with the premise, fiercely disagree with it, or find yourself somewhere in the muddy middle, this book offers a fascinating razor-sharp window into a massive cultural shift that is happening right under our noses.
It really does speak directly to a specific demographic.
Exactly. It speaks directly to those of you who are keenly interested in understanding the history of our modern institutions, specifically looking at the argument of how they may have been captured by progressive ideologies like feminism and Marxism.
It's a bold historical claim.
It is. I highly encourage you to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book yourself and to follow the author at Conrad Riker over at Substack. It's a dense, intense, and heavily layered read, and we're going to get right into the thick of it today.
Well, we certainly are, but before we actually get into the text and start unpacking the chapters, we need to set a very firm ground rule for today's analysis.
Yes, very important point here.
Because this book contains highly politically charged content. I mean, it touches on feminism, Marxism, the broader manosphere, and some deeply sensitive, highly polarized societal issues.
Extremely polarized.
Right. So I want to make it explicitly clear to you, the listener, that we are not taking sides today.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the author, nor are we here to debunk them. Our job here is strictly analytical.
We are just the messengers.
Exactly. We are simply going to impartially report on, synthesize, and help you understand the ideas, the frameworks, and the historical perspectives contained in the original source material.
Yeah.
We're essentially looking at the architecture of Riker's arguments to see exactly how he constructs his worldview and why it is resonating so strongly with his target audience.
Absolutely. And I think keeping that analytical distance is what makes a deep dive like this actually valuable.
Agreed.
So, to give you a broad overview before we get into the weeds, the core premise of Riker's book is that modern institutions, so everything from corporate HR departments to the media to academia, have been entirely captured by progressive ideologies.
The whole system, according to him.
Right, the whole system. He argues that this systemic capture has led directly to a profound, widespread crisis of masculinity in the modern world.
Which is the driving force behind the book.
Yes. In response to this crisis, he has written this manual. It's designed as a blueprint to offer men a way to reclaim their identity, establish their boundaries, and rediscover their traditional roles in a society he claims is actively hostile to them. Okay, let's unpack this.
Where does he even begin setting that up?
Well, Riker doesn't just start with a list of rules. He starts by painting a highly evocative picture of a storm brewing.
I like that phrasing.
Yeah, he describes a modern male identity crisis where traditional roles, the breadwinner, the protector, the warrior, are being actively eroded and demonized.
Yes, and he uses a rather brilliant melancholic metaphor early on in the first chapter to illustrate this disorientation.
Oh, the pocket watch thing.
Yes, the pocket watch. He compares the modern man to the inner workings of a tiny, rusted pocket watch. If you open it up, you can look at the intricate gears, the springs, the cogs, and you can see that it was obviously designed with a specific mechanical purpose.
It was built to do a job.
Right, it once kept perfect time, but now it just tick-tocks unevenly. It jams.
It doesn't work the way it was supposed to.
Yeah. Exactly. And if you don't understand the original design, you can't quite comprehend why it doesn't work anymore.
That's a great visual.
Riker argues that men are essentially these pocket watches, struggling to understand their functional roles in a world that constantly, relentlessly moves the goalposts of what it means to be a good man.
And he points directly to the history of feminism as the primary institutional driver of this historical disorientation.
He does.
I want to pause on that because it's a massive claim. He doesn't just say feminism is bad and leave it at that.
No, he's very methodical about it.
Right, he actually breaks down the history of feminism into 4 distinct waves to explain chronologically how we arrived at this current landscape.
Yeah.
He maps out the erosion of that pocket watch functionality.
Yeah.
How does he construct his historical perspective on those four waves?
It's a very systematic historical critique. According to the book, the first wave of feminism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was primarily about voting rights, property rights, and women's suffrage.
The stuff we all learn in history class.
Right. But Riker notes a fascinating historical connection here that often gets glossed over. He points out that this first wave was intimately tied to the temperance movement.
The push to ban alcohol.
Precisely. Many early suffragists felt women needed political power specifically to influence alcohol sales.
Because of the real issues with husbands drinking away the money.
Yes, because of the very real issue of men drinking away the family wages and committing domestic violence.
Okay, so how does Riker interpret that?
Riker's interpretation of this is that from its very inception, feminism wasn't just about gaining rights for women. It was simultaneously about utilizing institutional power to constrain and police male behavior.
That is a very specific lens to view the suffrage movement through. So he sees the very first wave as the initial mechanism of control. And then he moves to the second wave in the 60s and 70s.
Correct. This era, according to the text, was defined by the fight for reproductive rights, the cultural earthquake of the Supreme Court's decision in Roe v. Wade, and the publication of Betty Friedan's seminal book, The Feminine Mystique.
So shifting from voting to actual cultural liberation.
Exactly. Women's sexual independence and the mass entry of women into the corporate workforce took center stage.
And how did that affect the male role, in his view?
Riker argues this was the moment the traditional male role of the sole provider began to be dismantled as an absolute necessity for the survival of the family unit.
Which naturally leads into the third wave in the 1990s. This is where things get heavily theoretical, right?
Yes, very theoretical.
Where the focus shifted from establishing equality to actively deconstructing the concepts of gender themselves.
Exactly. The third wave sought to completely deconstruct traditional gender roles.
Breaking down what it means to be a man or a woman.
Right. It championed the idea of women as highly independent sexual beings while explicitly eschewing societal expectations of motherhood, domesticity, and female submissiveness. It was about breaking binaries.
And then we get to today.
Finally, Riker brings us to the present day with the fourth wave, which he firmly situates in the digital age.
Social media.
This wave doesn't rely on traditional organizing in town halls. It leverages digital technology, algorithms, and social media.
This is much faster.
Much faster. And instead of seeking legislative change, it focuses on raising collective consciousness and enforcing cultural norms through viral content.
Like cancel culture stuff.
Yes, with the Me Too movement being his prime, overarching example of this era.
So what does this all mean for the modern man? When you trace that lineage from temperance to Me Too, what is the cumulative effect, according to the author?
The so what of Riker's entire historical analysis is his assertion that these movements, while originally and perhaps ostensibly striving for equality and safety, have progressively alienated, marginalized, and emasculated men.
Basically pushing them out of their own roles.
He argues that from the first wave onward, the cultural narrative has been a zero-sum game where men have been losing cultural power, influence, and the exclusivity of their traditional roles.
By the third and fourth waves.
By the time we hit the third and fourth waves, traditional notions of manliness, stoicism, aggression, physical protection, unchecked ambition were no longer just being challenged. They were being actively pathologized and demonized.
Treated like a disease.
Exactly. They were replaced by demands for men to exhibit vulnerability, intense emotional intelligence, and passivity in ways that Riker argues contradict their fundamental biological nature.
So society is telling them to act in a way that goes against their hardware.
The book posits that this century-long progression has created a modern society that essentially views traditional masculinity inherently as a toxic element to be cured, rather than a natural force to be channeled.
And to make this heavy psychological toll relatable, because talking about historical ways can get very abstract, the book grounds this in some very specific, poignant anecdotes.
Yes, real human stories.
He introduces us to a guy named Martin. Martin is a man in his early 40s, and he was raised to be a classic traditional provider. He watched his father and his grandfather go to work, put food on the table, fix things around the house, and not complain.
The classic stoic archetype.
Exactly. That was the contract. But suddenly, the societal rules changed midway through his life. Martin was suddenly expected by his spouse and by the cultural media he consumed to seamlessly transition into being a highly communicative caretaker and an emotional sounding board.
Which he wasn't trained for.
Right. Riker writes that Martin simply couldn't shift gears. His ingrained expectations of what made him valuable, his paycheck, and his physical protection, were no longer considered enough.
That's devastating.
And this inability to completely rewire his psychological makeup to meet these new, contradictory demands ultimately cost him his marriage. He was left feeling like a failure for doing exactly what he was raised to do.
It's a powerful illustration of the shifting goalposts. And we see the exact opposite side of that generational spectrum with another anecdote about a younger man named Tom.
Oh, right, Tom's story is really sad.
Tom is in his mid-20s. He grew up entirely under these new fourth wave expectations.
So he did what he was told.
He was socialized in schools and by media to be deeply in touch with his feelings, to be soft-spoken, to be an ally, and to actively avoid being too traditionally masculine or alpha.
He followed the new rules perfectly.
But the text points out a tragic irony in Tom's story. When Tom experienced a profound loss, the death of a beloved pet he had owned for years, he found he couldn't actually express his grief the way he was supposedly encouraged to.
Why have it?
When he cried and showed deep vulnerability, his partner actually lost attraction to him, viewing him as weak.
Wow.
Society sends these incredibly mixed signals, explicitly demanding vulnerability, but implicitly, on a primal level, punishing men when they actually show it.
So he was punished for being vulnerable.
Tom was left entirely alone with his sorrow, confused by the contradiction between what women say they want and how they actually react.
That cognitive dissonance must be intense.
Riker uses these two stories, Martin and Tom, to argue that society needs to stop attempting to socially engineer and redefine men, because it's breaking them from the inside out.
It's a profound psychological burden the author is describing. You have older men feeling obsolete and younger men feeling paralyzed by contradiction.
It's a lose-lose situation.
And this internal identity crisis doesn't stay internal. It bleeds directly out into how men interact with women today. If the internal mechanism is broken, the external relationships are going to misfire.
That's a perfect way to phrase it.
Which naturally transitions us into how men navigate the romantic landscape. In part 2 of the book, Riker dives incredibly deep into modern courtship, hookup culture, and the harsh realities of evolutionary biology.
This is where the book gets really granular about modern dating.
He argues that the traditional courtship playbook, the one relying on chivalry, slow building confidence, shared community networks, and steadfastness, has been completely incinerated.
Burned to the ground.
Dating apps like Tinder, Bumble, and Hinge have taken the nuanced dance of courtship and turned it into a hyper-efficient, incredibly shallow numbers game.
And what's fascinating here is how the text doesn't just rely on angry rhetoric to make this point. It uses peer-reviewed academic research to back up its critique of this digital landscape.
Right, he actually brings the receipts.
Riker cites a specific study published in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships. The study investigates a modern dating phenomenon known as breadcrumbing.
Breadcrumbing. For the listener who might not be familiar with the clinical definition of that, how does this study define it?
Breadcrumbing is defined as the behavior of maintaining someone's romantic or sexual interest with occasional sporadic messages, likes, or digital interactions without any actual intention of committing or meeting up.
Basically, just leading someone on digitally.
The primary motivation, according to the research, is often to stroke one's own ego or keep a roster of backups available.
And how does that affect the men on these apps?
The book argues that average men are overwhelmingly on the receiving end of this behavior on dating apps. They are kept on the hook just enough to stay engaged, only to have that attention abruptly and harshly withdrawn when a more attractive option appears on the screen.
Like emotional whiplash.
Riker argues this cyclical process of false hope and rejection leaves average men feeling profoundly hurt, entirely confused, and ultimately deeply dehumanized. They become just another pixelated option to be swiped away.
The book shares a really striking, visceral example of this digital toll with a guy named Alex. Alex is a 32-year-old graphic designer. He's navigating these modern dating apps, trying to find a genuine connection.
Just a normal guy looking for love.
Exactly. But Riker explains that Alex had actually struggled with mild body dysmorphic disorder for a significant portion of his life, and the dating apps poured gasoline on that fire.
The visual nature of those apps is brutal.
When Alex opens his phone, he isn't just competing with the guys in his neighborhood anymore. He is thrust into a global marketplace where the algorithm actively pushes the top tier of physically attractive men to the forefront.
The top 1% of guys.
Right. He found himself endlessly scrolling through pictures of chiseled, incredibly muscular, tall men, constantly comparing his average physique to these unrealistic, often airbrushed, or chemically enhanced standards.
That would destroy anyone's confidence.
His self-esteem absolutely plummeted. He began to question his entire worth as a human being, not just as a man, simply because he didn't fit the extreme aesthetic criteria demanded by swipe culture. He became paralyzed by the sheer visual competition.
And Alex's story acts as the perfect bridge into the author's deep exploration of the science of attraction.
Because Riker is saying this isn't just superficial, it's biological.
Yes. Riker argues that while dating apps have warped, accelerated, and gamified the process of mate selection, the underlying biological hardwiring of human attraction has not changed one bit since we were hunter-gatherers.
We are still cavemen with smartphones.
Precisely. He leans heavily into evolutionary biology to explain what men and women are instinctively, subconsciously drawn to, despite whatever modern cultural conditioning might tell us.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because he challenges the idea that attraction is socially constructed. What are these deep biological hardwirings according to the text? Let's break down the actual evolutionary mechanics he presents.
From a purely evolutionary perspective, the book claims that women are instinctively, almost inescapably programmed to seek out men with a V-shaped torso, meaning broad shoulders tapering down to a slim waist.
Why that specific shape?
Because in an ancestral environment, these physical traits reliably signal good health, high testosterone levels, physical strength necessary for protection, and robust genetic material.
It's a biological shorthand for survivability.
Yes. Furthermore, and this is the heavily emphasized point in the text, the book discusses the concept of hypergamy.
Hypergamy, the instinct to marry up.
Exactly. Riker argues that women are biologically inclined, across all cultures, to seek mates who possess higher social status, greater physical dominance, or more accumulated resources than they do themselves.
So looking for the provider.
In an evolutionary context, this represents guaranteed security and stability for herself and her potential offspring during vulnerable periods of pregnancy and child rearing.
It makes sense from a survival standpoint. And what about the men?
On the flip side of this biological coin, men instinctively gravitate toward entirely different markers. Men look for women with high cheekbones, small chins, clear complexions, and a specific waist-to-hip ratio.
Not status or resources.
No, because the book argues these specific physical features are not just arbitrary beauty standards. They are physiological indicators of high levels of hormones, like estrogen and progesterone,
Which means what exactly?
which directly signal youth, fertility, good health, and the optimal capability of producing strong offspring. Men are wired for fertility markers. Women are wired for survival and resource markers.
And Riker knows the critics will say, well, that's just Western patriarchal conditioning. So he doesn't just stick to biological theory. He brings in specific cultural and anthropological examples from around the world to prove his point.
He wants to show it's universal.
Right, to prove that these drives transcend any specific culture or political system.
Yes, he explicitly and aggressively counters the progressive blank slate argument that gender roles and attraction triggers are merely arbitrary social constructs that can be unlearned.
By using real-world tribes.
To do this, he points to the Mosuo people of China.
Which is fascinating because the Mosul are famous for being a matrilineal society.
Right.
The women are the heads of the households.
Precisely. It is a society where women hold primary property rights, lineage is traced through the mother, and women engage in sexual relationships relatively freely without the traditional bounds of Western marriage.
A progressive sociologist might point to them as proof that traditional male dominance is a construct.
However, Riker looks at the exact same society and points out that even among the Mosuo, where women hold the institutional power, the men are still expected to demonstrate their worth and viability through rigorous physical labor, building and contributing resources to the mother's household.
So there still have to be the laborers and providers.
Their attractiveness is still inextricably linked to their utility and strength. He then pivots across the globe to the H hunter-gatherers of Paraguay.
A totally different environment.
In Ache culture, before a man can marry, he must essentially prove his worth by providing his prospective wife's family with a significant gift of high-value food, like heavily hunted meat and other difficult-to-acquire resources.
Bringing home the bacon, literally.
Riker refers to this anthropological concept as bride service. He uses these radical different societies, one a matriarchy in Asia, one a hunter-gatherer tribe in South America, to argue that despite massive cultural and geographic differences, the foundational male imperative to accumulate, protect, and offer resources is a universally demanded and universally attractive trait.
Biology always overrides culture.
That is his core thesis there.
So, if we accept Riker's premise for a moment, if human biology absolutely dictates that men are hardwired to provide and protect, and women are hardwired to seek those resources, what happens when the very foundation of the family unit, the ultimate destination of those biological drives, is threatened?
That creates immense anxiety.
It really does. That brings us to part 3 of the book, The Paternity Crisis, and the false promise of gender equality.
This is a heavy section.
If men are feeling this intense evolutionary pressure to provide, it naturally creates a massive anxiety around ensuring the family unit is actually theirs. The author issues a stark, uncompromising warning about the decline of traditional marriage and fidelity.
Because the stakes are so high for men biologically?
He argues that modern men must be incredibly proactive in protecting their genetic and financial interests, specifically by demanding DNA tests to ensure paternity before committing to the monumental task of co-parenting or marriage.
This is undoubtedly one of the most controversial and major focal points of the entire book.
Absolutely.
Riker discusses how the modern shift away from strictly enforced traditional monogamy, combined with the ease of digital hookup culture, has created a severe, unprecedented vulnerability for men.
Because they might raise a child that isn't theirs.
Throughout human history, a man's greatest evolutionary fear is investing his finite resources, time, and labor into raising offspring that do not carry his genetic material.
It goes against everything we just talked about.
Riker advocates strongly for the widespread, normalized use of non-invasive prenatal testing, commonly known as NIPT.
NIPT. This is a medical advancement that has really changed the landscape.
Yeah.
How does it work in the context Riker is describing?
NIPT is a revolutionary medical tool. It requires just a single, simple blood draw from the mother during the first trimester of pregnancy.
So it's safe.
Because tiny fragments of fetal DNA circulate in the mother's bloodstream, this test can analyze that DNA with incredible accuracy.
Very early on.
From Riker's perspective, this allows a man to confirm his biological paternity of the child before the baby is even born, without any risk of miscarriage that older procedures like amniocentesis carried.
But asking for a DNA test is usually seen as a huge insult.
The book goes to great length to frame the request for this test not as an insult to the partner or a lack of trust, but as a necessary, rational, biological, and legal safeguard.
Just a standard procedure.
In a modern world where traditional fidelity is no longer culturally guaranteed or legally enforced, Riker argues that verifying paternity is the ultimate act of self-preservation for a man.
And he drives this point home with anecdotes that are, quite frankly, genuinely heart-wrenching. He doesn't just rely on statistics of paternity fraud. He gives us the human cost.
These stories are tough to read.
He tells the story of John. John is an older man who went into the hospital for what he thought was a routine medical procedure, perhaps needing a specific blood or tissue match from family.
And what did the doctors find?
During the preliminary testing, the doctors pulled him aside and revealed that his teenage child, whom he had loved and raised for over a decade, was not his biological offspring.
Unbelievable.
His entire reality, his legacy, was completely shattered in a sterile doctor's office.
Just a total collapse of everything he knew.
Then there's George. George believed he had a loving, remarkably stable marriage. They were the couple everyone envied.
The picture-perfect family.
But during a standard genetic medical screening for a minor issue with his child, the genetic markers didn't align. He discovered he had been spending his life's energy raising another man's baby, and his wife had carried the secret for years.
Another devastating blow.
And finally, there's Jack, representing the digital age version of this betrayal. Jack found a suspicious, veiled text message on his partner's phone while she was pregnant.
A modern nightmare.
It gnawed at him. He investigated further, demanded a test after the birth, and discovered the child he was preparing to love was a product of an affair.
Riker uses these stories as incredibly potent cautionary tales.
They really are. They are stark warnings about the cultural erosion of monogamy and the devastating, soul-crushing betrayal that can occur when men blindly trust the romantic narrative without verifying the biological reality.
If we connect these individual tragedies to the broader systemic picture Riker is painting throughout the book, he views this paternity crisis as merely a symptom of a much larger, more insidious issue.
Which is?
The false narratives and deliberate obfuscations surrounding the modern concept of gender equality.
This is where he tackles the wage gap, right?
One of the primary, most heavily attacked targets of his cultural critique is the gender wage gap. The author argues forcefully and with extensive citation that the wage gap, as it is popularly framed by progressive politicians and media as a symbol of systemic oppression, is a statistical myth deliberately used to dismantle the concept of patriarchy.
So he says the gap isn't caused by sexism.
He contends that the disparity in average median earnings between all men and all women is not the result of systemic patriarchal discrimination.
Right. He doesn't deny the gap exists mathematically. He completely reattributes the cause of the gap to biological differences and the resulting personal choices.
Precisely. This is where he ties everything back to endocrinology and biology. The book argues that men are biologically predisposed to possess significantly higher testosterone levels.
How does that affect their careers?
This hormonal reality makes them, on average, more aggressive, more competitive, and more tolerant of extreme physical or financial risks.
Taking the hard jobs.
Because of this, men disproportionately self-select into higher risk, higher stress, or physically dangerous jobs, like offshore drilling, high-stakes financial trading, or demanding quota-driven sales roles.
Jobs that pay more because nobody wants to do them.
These roles inherently pay significantly more due to the basic economic principles of supply, demand, and hazard pay.
And what about women's choices in his view?
Conversely, the book claims that women who possess higher levels of oxytocin and different evolutionary pressures naturally gravitate toward roles requiring more interpersonal empathy, nurturing, and social cohesion.
Caretaking roles.
This leads them to disproportionately choose career paths like human resources, early childhood education, nursing, or customer service.
Which don't pay as much.
While deeply valuable to society, these roles simply do not command the same premium in a capitalist market as high-risk wealth generation or hazardous labor.
So it's a difference in preference, not oppression.
Raker argues that acknowledging these fundamental biological differences in preference and risk tolerance is absolutely essential. He posits that attempting to force a 50-50 gender outcome across all fields and all salary brackets through diversity initiatives is an authoritarian disregard for natural human inclinations.
Okay, so he is laying out a worldview heavily rooted in biological determinism. But that brings us to the forces that, according to the book, actively and aggressively try to suppress these biological truths.
The institutions pushing back.
If biology is so obvious, why isn't it accepted? That's where part 4 comes in, tackling the tyranny of political correctness and SJW tactics.
Social justice warriors.
The author dives into the profound chilling effect of modern cancel culture. He argues that men everywhere, from corporate boardrooms to college campuses, are absolutely terrified of speaking their minds or stating basic biological facts because of the intense career-ending backlash they might face.
The fear of being canceled is very real.
There is a deep, pervasive fear of being publicly labeled toxic, a bigot, or misogynistic. This fear leads to massive, widespread self-censorship, where men simply nod along with ideologies they privately despise.
To illustrate the historical gravity of this censorship, the text actually draws philosophical parallels between ancient thinkers like Socrates and Voltaire, who faced severe public scrutiny and even death for challenging the orthodoxies of their time, and modern individuals navigating the digital public square.
That's a pretty intense comparison, but he has modern examples too.
But Riker doesn't just rely on ancient history, he points to 2 highly publicized modern, real-world examples to anchor his point.
Let's talk about those.
First, he brings up James Damore. Damore was the former Google software engineer who was famously fired after writing an internal corporate memo.
I remember that memo causing a huge uproar.
The memo respectfully suggested that the glaring gender gap in tech and coding roles could be partly due to the exact same biological differences in interest we just discussed.
Men favoring things, women favoring people.
Yes, men favoring systematizing in things, women favoring empathizing in people rather than purely the result of a toxic, systemically sexist culture at Google.
And how did the company react?
The book highlights how Damore meticulously used clear evolutionary psychology and scientific reasoning, heavily citing peer-reviewed studies, yet he was still relentlessly dragged through the global media mud, labeled a misogynist, and summarily terminated by one of the most powerful corporations on Earth.
That definitely sends a message to other men in tech to keep their mouths shut.
Second, he deeply analyzes the rise of Jordan Peterson. The Canadian psychology professor faced massive coordinated smear campaigns, intense demonization, and accusations of hate speech simply for critiquing social justice orthodoxies, specifically regarding compelled speech legislation in Canada.
Peterson really became a lightning rod.
Riker emphasizes the severe psychological and reputational toll these relentless attacks took on Peterson, using him as the ultimate illustration of the destructive, punitive power of modern progressive cancel culture against any man who steps out of line.
And the book doesn't just complain about cancel culture, it gets incredibly granular on how this culture operates on a mechanical level.
It breaks down the actual tactics.
It systematically unpacks the specific psychological manipulation tactics used by social justice warriors, or SJWs, and progressive institutions. Let's go through these tactics because Riker lays them out like a military playbook. He wants the reader to be able to identify the attack as it's happening.
What's fascinating here is how clinical his breakdown of rhetorical warfare is. First, he discusses the tactic of gaslighting.
We hear that term a lot. How does he apply it institutionally?
He defines it as manipulating reality on a mass scale to make the opposition doubt their own sanity or their own eyes.
Like telling someone they didn't see what they just saw.
The book cites a highly controversial example regarding media coverage of a political protest in Charlottesville. Riker claims the media deliberately exaggerated the presence and influence of extreme white supremacists to fit a specific, predetermined narrative,
Effectively shifting public opinion.
and gaslighting anyone who pointed out the nuance or the presence of peaceful, non-extremist demonstrators.
Okay, what's the next tactic?
Second, he identifies narrative control, which is the act of overwhelming the public discourse to distract from inconvenient truths.
Changing the subject on a national scale.
The author points to the prolonged Russian collusion narrative pushed heavily by mainstream media during the Trump administration. Riker argues this was a compelling cinematic story pushed continuously for years to distract the populace from domestic institutional failures.
Despite the lack of definitive evidence, according to him.
Yes, despite what he claims was a massive lack of actionable evidence at the time.
He also talks at length about the tactic of false dilemmas. This is a very common rhetorical trap.
The either-or fallacy.
This is where progressives force people into a rigid corner. They present an issue and say, either you completely and unconditionally accept their radical totalizing agenda, or you are immediately branded a racist, a fascist, or a misogynist.
There is no middle ground allowed.
There is no room for moderate critique. It silences dissent by making the social cost of any alternative viewpoint utterly fatal to one's career and reputation.
And then there's the weaponizing of language. Riker argues that the actual definitions of words are constantly, deliberately being redefined to suit political ends.
That's a powerful tool.
He uses the word privilege as his prime example. He states that historically, privilege was a descriptor of a specific, usually earned or class-based advantage.
Like being born into royalty or immense wealth.
But progressives have transformed it into a weapon used to bludgeon people, specifically white men, based entirely on the immutable circumstances of their birth, rendering their individual struggles or achievements completely invalid in the eyes of society.
And tying all of these manipulative tactics together is the overarching foundational concept of double standards.
Yes, the hypocrisy of the system.
This is where Riker uses data to highlight the hypocrisy he sees. The text provides a very specific, arresting statistic drawn from the National Center for Biotechnology Information, or NCBI.
A very credible source.
The study cited claims that 38% of men report having been falsely accused of sexual misconduct or inappropriate behavior at some point in their lives, compared to only 27% of women reporting the same.
That is a massive discrepancy.
Riker uses this significant 11-point discrepancy to argue that society operates on a terrifying double standard. He posits that institutions from university Title IX offices to corporate HR are incredibly quick, almost eager to believe a woman's allegation without evidence,
While dismissing the man's side.
while immediately and systemically dismissing a man's denial or demand for due process. He views this weaponization of accusation as the ultimate manifestation of political correctness, actively disenfranchising and terrorizing men.
And this brings us to a really heavy pivot in the book.
Because when men feel entirely disenfranchised, when they feel silenced by cancel culture, terrified of false accusations, and completely alienated by the brutal realities of modern algorithmic dating, it inevitably leads to a very dark place.
A very dangerous place.
Part 5 of the book explores this consequence, the dark side of the shift and the rise of incel culture. Incel, for those who might not know, stands for involuntarily celibate.
A term that has gotten a lot of media attention.
Now, the book approaches this incredibly heavy, often marked topic in a surprising way. It doesn't approach it by mocking these men as losers, but by trying to deeply understand the sociological forces that created them.
Trying to find the root cause.
Riker paints the modern incel phenomenon as a tragic, almost inevitable mathematical consequence of everything we've discussed. Hypersexualized, algorithmic dating standards, the complete erosion of traditional male utility, and a massive societal empathy gap when it comes to acknowledging men's genuine struggles.
This section raises a deeply uncomfortable but important question about how society handles male alienation.
The empathy gap is huge.
When women struggle, society generally mobilizes support systems, campaigns, and empathy. When men struggle, society often tells them to man up, or worse, labels their struggle as toxic entitlement.
Nobody cares if men are lonely.
The text argues that because men's traditional avenues for gaining respect, being sole providers and protectors, have been aggressively dismantled, and because they face intense pressure to conform to unrealistic top 1% dating standards without any emotional support network, they naturally retreat.
Where do they go?
They retreat into the darkest corners of the internet. They form online echo chambers. The profound danger here, which Riker outlines clearly, is radicalization.
It becomes a feedback loop of anger.
The book explains how these isolated online forums act as accelerators, breeding an incredibly toxic environment of shared self-pity, virulent misogyny, and extreme nihilistic anger.
And then it doesn't always stay online.
To underline the absolute severity of this threat, Riker doesn't hold back. He specifically cites the tragic 2018 Toronto van attack.
I remember that horrific day.
Alec Manassian, an attacker deeply embedded in incel ideology and motivated by his perceived inability to attract women, rented a van and murdered 10 people.
A completely senseless tragedy.
The text frames this horrific event not as an isolated incident of madness, but as a horrifying logical endpoint of what happens when toxic, fatalistic ideologies are allowed to take root and fester in deeply isolated, profoundly frustrated young men who feel they have absolutely no stake in society.
But it is absolutely crucial to note here, and I want to make sure you, the listener, understand this because the author makes it very explicit. Riker does not endorse incel behavior, violence, or their core ideology.
He strongly condemns it.
In fact, he uses this chapter to actively and aggressively challenge their mindset. He views the incel mindset as a complete failure of masculinity. So, if society is broken, as he claims, but the incel reaction is also wrong, what is Riker's proposed solution for these men who feel left behind?
His solution is fiercely rooted in extreme personal responsibility and the absolute rejection of victimhood.
No more feeling sorry for yourself.
While he sympathizes with the societal forces that alienated them, he demands that these men abandon their toxic entitlement. They must discard the deeply flawed belief that the world, or any woman in it, owes them romantic success or physical intimacy simply for existing.
So they have to do the work.
Instead, he urges a radical pivot towards self-improvement. They need to look inward before they blame the outward. They must dedicate themselves heavily to developing their baseline confidence, honing their completely atrophied social skills, and drastically increasing their emotional intelligence so they can actually read a room and interact normally.
And what about their view of women?
Furthermore, he explicitly and unequivocally states that they must actively dismantle their misogynistic beliefs. They must learn to view women as complex individuals and equals deserving of baseline respect, rather than viewing them as achievements to be unlocked or commodities to be conquered.
Real masculinity, according to him.
The book argues forcefully that true, actualized masculinity is about emotional connectedness, stoic resilience, and building oneself up to be a person of value, not wallowing in anger, resentment, and internet-fueled nihilism.
So how does a man actually build that resilience? How does he stop being a victim of modern culture and start navigating this complex world on his own terms?
That's the practical application of his philosophy.
That brings us to part 6, which is really the prescriptive core of the book, The Red Pill Toolkit. This section covers actionable advice on self-improvement, setting ironclad boundaries, and mastering what the manosphere calls game.
This is the manual part of the book.
First, let's define the terminology. What exactly does the author mean when he talks about the Red Pill Awakening?
The term, borrowed obviously from the movie The Matrix, is used in this context to describe a paradigm shift in worldview.
Waking up from the simulation.
The Red Pill Awakening is described in the text as a profoundly painful, often disorienting, but absolutely necessary psychological transition. It involves the agonizing process of breaking free from years of societal programming, progressive conditioning, and the blue pill illusions of politically correct culture that tell you everyone is equal and romance is a Disney movie.
It's a harsh reality check.
It requires a man to suddenly start viewing relationships, social hierarchies, and his own life through the cold, unforgiving lens of objective biological truths and rational, unsentimental analysis.
Which he admits is not a pleasant experience.
The book openly acknowledges that this awakening is not fun. It can cause a severe identity crisis. It often leads to profound alienation from longtime friends, colleagues, or even family members who remain comfortably embedded in the old blue pill mindset.
But he says it's necessary.
But Riker insists it is the only viable path to achieving genuine autonomy and personal fulfillment in a world that otherwise seeks to exploit you.
And a huge foundational part of achieving that autonomy is what he calls the power of boundaries.
Boundaries are everything in his framework.
Riker argues that modern men have been meticulously conditioned to walk on eggshells, to constantly apologize for taking up space, and to prioritize everyone else's comfort over their own. But he asserts that establishing boundaries is the absolute baseline for male mental health.
He has a great analogy for this.
And I love the analogy he uses here. He uses a fantastic pop culture example that really crystallizes the point. Tony Soprano.
The ultimate tough guy.
Now, Tony Soprano is a hyper-masculine, incredibly tough, violent mob boss. But the book points out a brilliant psychological detail from the show.
His panic attacks.
Tony's complete and utter lack of emotional boundaries with his toxic, narcissistic mother, Livia, and his inability to set boundaries with the chaotic members of his mafia family led directly to his debilitating panic attacks and reckless, impulsive behavior.
His body physically rebelled against the lack of boundaries.
Riker uses this to prove that it doesn't matter how physically tough, rich, or intimidating you think you are. If you do not have rigid psychological boundaries, the world will crush you and you will not be able to function.
That is a very astute analysis of that character, and Riker applies this concept of defensive boundaries directly to the modern cultural climate we discussed earlier, specifically aiming his critique at the aftermath of the Me Too movement.
How so?
While the book begrudgingly acknowledges the movement's original noble intentions regarding exposing genuine workplace harassment and assault, Riker argues that the extreme, unnuanced manifestation of the believe all women mantra created a deeply toxic, paranoid environment completely lacking in fundamental due process.
Guilty until proven innocent.
He claims it resulted in a terrifying landscape where innocent men could be and were falsely accused and financially ruined overnight by an HR department prioritizing PR over truth. Establishing strict professional and personal boundaries is presented as the vital antidote.
Like the Mike Pence rule.
This means actively controlling one's environment, never being alone behind closed doors with female colleagues, similar to the Mike Pence rule, and ruthlessly limiting exposure to toxic or unstable influences. Boundaries are the armor men must wear to survive this landscape.
Let's shift from survival to romance. The toolkit goes into immense detail on the game and relationship strategies. Now, game isn't about cheesy pickup lines here, it's about social dynamics.
Navigating the modern dating market.
Riker specifically warns men to avoid two highly destructive traps. First is the nice guy syndrome.
A very common trap.
This is the incredibly common, false, and manipulative belief that being excessively polite, subservient, and constantly agreeing with a woman will somehow make a man irresistibly attractive. Riker points out this is a covert contract that women can smell a mile away, and it only generates disgust, not desire.
And the second trap.
The second trap he warns against is the snowflake woman. This is a partner who presents herself as exceptionally innocent, fragile, and constantly aggrieved by the world, but who is actually deeply manipulative, emotionally draining, and self-centered.
So what's the correct approach?
The author advises men to utilize genuine confidence, high social intelligence, and a deep, unapologetic understanding of the female biological attraction triggers we discussed earlier, like displaying competence and emotional stability to navigate these waters successfully and attract a high-value partner.
And beyond just romantic relationships, the toolkit places a massive, almost overriding emphasis on mentorship and networking among men.
Finding your tribe.
The text notes a truly staggering, deeply concerning statistic. Over 23 million children in the United States currently live in homes without a father present.
That is a staggering number.
Riker argues that this systemic lack of positive, strong male role models is absolutely devastating to young men's psychological and social development. They are growing up without a compass. Therefore, actively seeking out and finding mentors is critical to survival.
Who does he suggest they look to?
The book references several figures as examples of modern mentorship. He mentions controversial figures like Rushdie, specifically for his raw, unfiltered insights into the brutal realities of modern dating dynamics.
And Peterson again.
And he returns to Jordan Peterson, highlighting Peterson's profound lessons on shouldering personal responsibility, standing up straight, and bringing order to one's life. These are presented as the archetypes of modern mentors men can look to when their own fathers are absent.
And it's not just about looking up to mentors, it's about looking side to side. Building your own network of peers is just as important. The book shares a great practical story about Dave and Mike.
I like that story.
These are two ordinary guys who met by chance at a local professional networking event. They struck up a conversation, bonded over a shared nerdy passion for vintage comic books, and realized they had complementary skills.
A simple connection.
That shared male bonding eventually led them to co-found a highly successful independent publishing company. Riker even pulls in a famous quote from Steve Jobs about how you can only connect the dots of your life looking backward.
The power of a solid network.
He uses this to emphasize that building a strong, tight-knit network of like-minded, ambitious men provides crucial emotional support, unexpected career opportunities, and perhaps most importantly in today's climate, a safe, unpoliced space to discuss ideas freely without fear of being canceled.
Finally, to support all of these external strategies, the toolkit rests on three absolutely foundational internal pillars for a man's daily life. Riker calls them fitness, finance, and faith.
The 3 F's. Let's start with fitness.
First, for fitness, it is about far more than just looking good on a beach. It is about actively reclaiming your physical strength and vitality through grueling activities like heavy weightlifting, martial arts, or immersive outdoor wilderness exploration.
Pushing the body to its limits.
It is a deliberate physical rebellion against the soft, sedentary, domesticated man box that modern corporate culture tries to force men into.
And finance.
Second, for finance, achieving absolute financial independence is paramount. The book argues forcefully that relying on a romantic partner, remaining dependent on your parents, or relying on government assistance for your survival fundamentally destroys a man's autonomy.
It makes you vulnerable.
It strips him of his leverage and opens him up to endless coercion and manipulation. You must control your own resources to control your own destiny.
And regarding that third pillar, faith, the book has a really interesting pragmatic take. Because you might expect a book like this to be purely secular or purely dogmatic. But it doesn't actually push one specific denomination or religion.
It's very functional.
Instead, it highlights the psychological and structural value of religious discipline in a general sense.
Correct. It takes a highly functionalist view of religion. The text discusses Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and other organized faiths, arguing that religion provides a necessary, rigid moral framework and a profound psychological resilience against the chaotic, shifting pressures of modern secular society.
He uses some famous athletes as examples, right?
Riker uses several high-profile, highly successful examples to illustrate this point. He points to Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, highlighting his unwavering public commitment to his family structure and his faith as the bedrock of his massive success.
And Tim Tebow.
He looks at Tim Tebow, who famously used his devout Christian faith to navigate intense media mockery and professional career obstacles without compromising his core values.
And Kobe.
And he discusses the late Kobe Bryant, who frequently spoke about how he found profound focus, forgiveness, and resilience in his Catholic beliefs during the darkest, most challenging periods of his life and marriage.
That discipline matters.
The book posits that deep religious devotion, regardless of the specific creed, provides men with a solid, immovable foundation of discipline, a higher purpose beyond hedonism, and a supportive community that the hyper-individualistic, secular, progressive world simply cannot offer.
So what does this all mean? We have covered an absolutely massive amount of ground today. We started with the historical roots of the temperance movement and the 4 ways of feminism.
A huge historical sweep.
We journeyed through the harsh realities of algorithmic dating apps, the evolutionary biology of the V-shape and hypergamy, the intense anxieties surrounding the paternity crisis, the weaponization of language by cancel culture, the tragedy of the incel movement, and finally, the rigid architecture of the Red Pill toolkit.
If we take a step back and synthesize the incredibly diverse, controversial chapters of this manual, a very clear, undeniable, bigger picture emerges.
How would you summarize it?
You, the listener, may entirely reject the politics presented here. You might find the critique of feminism deeply flawed. You may violently disagree with the strict, uncompromising biological determinism that underpins the entire book.
Sure, many people will.
However, the text undeniably perfectly captures a massive, churning cultural undercurrent that is reshaping our society. Red Pill serves as a fascinating, highly detailed blueprint of exactly how a specific, rapidly growing demographic of men is responding to a world they feel has turned hostile.
It's a reaction to the modern world.
They are reacting to rapid, disorienting societal shifts, relentless digital information overload, and fundamentally radically changing gender dynamics. This book is a visceral reaction to a world they feel has gleefully left them behind, and it offers them a highly structured, unapologetic path to reclaim their sense of self and their place in the hierarchy.
It really is a window into a powerful, undeniable cultural movement, whether you like the view or not. And that leaves me with a final, somewhat provocative thought for you to mull over as we finish up.
Let's hear it.
We've spent this whole time discussing the book's premise that biology is destiny. But think about this. If evolutionary biology truly hardwires our attraction, as Riker's book so strongly suggests, with men instinctively seeking fertility and women instinctively seeking resources and physical protection, what happens next?
That is the big question.
Because our digital technology, artificial intelligence, and our social structures are continuing to evolve at absolute warp speed, far outpacing our genetic mutation. Will future generations, fully integrated with technology, eventually develop entirely new, biologically adapted mating strategies?
Bypassing the old hardware.
Strategies that completely bypass these traditional hunter-gatherer gender roles entirely. Are we, right now, just living through the awkward, painful, incredibly messy teenage phase of human social evolution, caught between our primal DNA and our digital future? It's absolutely something to think about.
It really is.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to address you directly. We have only scratched the surface of the density of this material. If you want to truly understand this perspective firsthand, to see the arguments, the citations, and the rhetoric exactly as the author lays them out, you need to read this for yourself.
You really have to read the source.
I highly encourage you to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy Red Pilled, The Manual for Men in the Modern World by Conrad Riker. And make sure to follow @ConradRiker at Substack to keep up with his latest writings and cultural commentary.
It's definitely worth checking out.
Also, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the deep dive so we can keep bringing you these expansive explorations of today's most talked about controversial sources. Thank you so much for joining us, for keeping an open, analytical mind, and we will see you on the next deep dive.